as giving a little bit of an explanation on what other infrastructure the UDO covers. At the outset, I want to give a couple of disclaimers. One, as you may be able to tell by the tone of my voice and or my throat clearing, I am desperately trying to get over some issues with my voice and my throat. So I apologize for that at the outset. There may be a time where I have to put my microphone on mute to clear my voice or take a second to get a drink to refresh my throat. Additionally, we have got a lot of ground that we're going to be covering this evening. And if you're not familiar with some of these concepts, they can seemingly come at you fast and furiously. That being said, we are remaining committed to engaging in a dialogue with you guys and being available to answer any questions and offer any clarifications that you may need on any of the material that you see this evening. Staff, myself, will narrate this evening's presentation to kick off our conversation. We ask that you enter any questions or comments in the chat box so that we can see it. And we've got a lot of support staff with us for this virtual conversation that will make every effort to respond to your comments and your questions in real time as the presentation goes forward. If at all we happen to not get a question or comment addressed, or we feel the need that it requires a little bit more of a nuanced explanation than something that we can type in response in the chat, after our presentation, we'll circle back during the discussion portion of our conversation and offer those answers and clarifications. If you would, and I think everybody in our recent times is familiar with how the chat box and certainly Zoom may work. If you would take a second and locate the chat in your screen, it's going to be probably at the bottom of your screen, a little comic dialogue looking box. If you would click on that, and if you would just by way of introducing yourself, maybe type your name and any association, organization, or neighborhood you're representing, just so we can have a sense of who's in the room and then get you acclimated to using and communicating with us through that chat box as well. So if you would take a minute and input some information in the chat for me, that would be great. And as you do that, as I said, once at the conclusion of our presentation, we'll spend a few minutes to circle back to anything that we haven't yet addressed or things that we may need to offer some additional clarification on. Is not seeing anything in chat. Are we having any? How about staff? Can staff put something up? Katie, I see you. Thank you. Welcome from Sedgefield.
Thank you.
So as we go forward, this is the first in a series of two virtual conversations we're going to have with regard to subdivision, streets, and infrastructure. They're broken out into today's session, and then we're going to have an additional session in just short of middle January next year. Today, we're hoping to give you some information on what are and are not subdivisions and when the subdivision standards apply. Also, trying to help you understand what is required for review and approval of subdivisions and also exempt plats. We want to help you understand how development builds connectivity and contributes to the city's transportation network. Also, how the UDO provides guidance on access to properties through driveways and cross access. And then finally, what other development infrastructure the UDO provides guidance on. That's the purpose of today's conversation. In a couple of weeks, well, excuse me, at the beginning of next year, during our second conversation, we're going to get a little bit more detailed with some of the stuff that we'll touch at a very high level this evening. And we'll also cover required new streets and improvements and the standards for them. That January session will provide information on when or if development triggers new or improved streetscape. You'll also learn where the standards for those improvements are located, which will give you a sense of how those improvements will look in their physical form in the community. And then also touching base a little bit more in depth on what is being put forward as the Comprehensive Transportation Review, or CTR, which will provide information on how development mitigates transportation impacts in and around projects. Looking at our UDO schedule, we are in the first public engagement and comments phase after releasing the first public draft of the UDO in October. This will carry forward through January 2022, at which point we will release a second, after taking into consideration all of the feedback, comments, and suggestions that we receive during our engagement in comment period, release a second UDO draft in March of next year. We will enter a second public engagement and comment phase spanning March and April next year, with a targeted public hearing draft being compiled in May of next year, to take that draft for a public hearing in June of next year. Also seeking a planning committee recommendation in June, which will help us compile a adoption draft in July of next year, to which we are currently projecting a targeted UDO adoption from council as well. So some of you may know that in the summer of this year, in June, the city passed a comprehensive plan, the Charlotte Future 2040 comprehensive plan, that provides the policies and plans and the vision for how the city would like to grow over the course of the next couple of decades. The UDO, how the UDO plays into that is it is the implementation piece. So we're actually taking what has been set out as the vision and the policies and the plans, and actually putting them into action through the regulatory tools and language of the UDO to put that into our communities. As you can see here, the UDO takes several, about 8 different development-oriented regulations, and compiles and collates them into one guiding document. So why are we doing this? As I mentioned, the UDO is the primary regulatory tool for implementing what the Charlotte Future 2040 comprehensive plan has set out. We're also doing this to create more predictability for future development, as well as I touched on, align all development regulations so they work seamlessly together, including updating our standards to current best practices and revising and adjusting them as trends and or development may warrant. Excuse me. Also, again, touching on this, they develop a UDOs to consolidate the development regulations into a single document. And then within that document, all of the similar specific topic related pieces all collated into the same place as well. And we're aiming for this to be a more user-friendly ordinance with some simplified terms and common language, as well as an increased use in graphics. And then also the North Carolina legislature updated the regulatory framework for planning and development regulation for all jurisdictions in July of this year. And so some of what our efforts are geared at is ensuring that our Unified Development Ordinance complies with that new regulatory framework. In the UDO, you'll find several different parts. There's an introductory part, zoning, which is a large part of it, which encompasses districts, uses, and some general development standards. The piece that we're meeting on here tonight, which is the subdivision, streets, and other infrastructure piece, stormwater and natural resource piece, and also a UDO administration, nonconformities, and enforcement piece. And as I said, tonight we're going to be touching on subdivision, streets, and other infrastructure. So I've used this abbreviation a couple of times, SSI, and so I think it would behoove us to just put out there, what are we referring to when we say SSI? Well, first, we're referring to subdivisions, and those are the subject to subdivisions where we may be getting new streets, or what you may think as typical or traditional greenfield development, where it may be a new neighborhood being constructed. but there's also some, excuse me, a framework for what are called not subject to developments in the subdivision article, which can encompass things like infill development, and in itself comes with some exemptions that release it from having to comply with necessarily maybe all of the subdivision standards. And then we're talking about streets, things within the street, like the streets themselves, the blocks, curb and gutter, amenity zone and planting strips, sidewalk, shared use paths, and also off-street public paths. And then recognizing that a lot of our infrastructure comes from subdivision, certainly streets is infrastructure. There are also other infrastructure pieces that may be drainage and water supply or sewer as well. And those are the things, so that's what we've taken to calling SSI, subdivision, streets, and infrastructure. The SSI piece particularly is part 10 of the Unified Development Ordinance, and it is broken out into 6 individual articles. Article 30 is our introduction article. Article 31 is our subdivision article. Article 32 refers to network cross-access and driveway regulations. Article 33 is required new streets and transportation improvements. Article 34 are those standards for those streets and additional transportation improvements like off-street public paths and cross-access. And then Article 35 touches base on some of that other infrastructure I referenced earlier. Tonight, we're going to discuss a little bit about Article 30, 31, and 32, as well as 35, and then the more detailed information about Articles 33 and 34 will come at that second conversation date in mid-January. So kicking off with Article 30, the introduction to SSI, it really lays out what the purpose, applicability, and administration of Part 10 of the UDO, the SSI piece, going forward. The purpose for the SSI part is to allow for and promote the orderly development of the city and the areas in its extraterritorial jurisdiction. It would this part would apply to development activity in those areas. And then you may be familiar that currently we have a subdivision administrator. Excuse me. He is with us this evening. His name is Josh Weaver. And going forward, because this part of the UDO encompasses more than just subdivision, it encompasses those streets pieces and encompasses those infrastructure pieces, we really see really the administration of this part of the UDO becoming not so much as it currently is like with a subdivision administrator, but moving to more a role where it's a subdivision, street, and other infrastructure administrator. And with that, I would like to introduce our current subdivision administrator, Mr. Josh Weaver, and he will take you through the next couple of slides. Josh?
Good evening. So the subdivision ordinance is given to us. The authority for the subdivision ordinance comes from the state statute, and within that, there are 2 types of things. There's things that are subject to the subdivision ordinance and things that are not. So really any division of land is a subdivision, but things that are, say, less than 2 acres and maybe they're not creating more than 3 lots would be exempt from the ordinance based on the definition of a subdivision from the state statute. And other examples could be when all lots created are greater than 10 acres, or properties that are divided for deeds or for estates and for other reasons. Go ahead, you can go full. Okay, so typically a subdivision, there's 2 types of subdivisions that are subject to the ordinance. Those are major and minor subdivisions. Major subdivisions are things like you typically think of a new neighborhood that comes in with streets, lots of new houses, improvements to existing streets, and they may also include greenways and open space that goes along with a subdivision. Minor subdivisions, on the other hand, are smaller. They're generally along existing streets, and they are subject to the ordinance in that they are required to install curb, gutter, and sidewalk, and maybe the street trees and tree save that goes with them, but are generally smaller infill sites. So when things are subject to the subdivision ordinance, there's lots of considerations that go with them. We look at how those streets are designed, whether there's existing half streets that need to be improved by building the other half of the street, whether there's mature trees and natural vegetation, how those new subdivisions will interact with parks and schools and greenways. If a site is parallel to a thoroughfare, then, or if a site is adjacent to a thoroughfare, we may need to build a street next to it so that all those residences aren't accessing the thoroughfare. We also look at how those sites would interact with schools and other public facilities like police stations and fire stations. We check to make sure that all the street names are consistent with regulations, whether there's easements that have to do with access or Duke Power or gas and water and sewer easements. We also look to make sure that there's no flooding or lots that would be subject to flooding within that subdivision. And if a site is on the lake, whether those lots would need access to the lake. So when something is subject to the subdivision ordinance, when we have a large neighborhood coming in, we start with a sketch plan. That's generally when the designer for the developer submits broad stroke ideas of what they plan to do to make sure that we can iron out any major concerns that or major problems with the plan, trying to iron out all those deficiencies before they move into the full construction document process. Once we've ironed out those issues, then we move on to full construction plans for a neighborhood. Those include how the streets will be laid out, how making sure the sidewalks meet ADA compliance, whether there's greenway that needs to be dedicated. All of that's worked out during the construction plan process. Once the plans meet all the requirements of the city ordinances, then the developer can submit for a grading permit. That's when they actually start work on the project, and we are involved throughout that process with our construction inspectors, making sure that it's built per the construction plans. Now, once the project is mostly constructed and the developer's ready to sell houses or start to build houses, they would submit a final plat. And that's what legally creates the lots, and the streets are dedicated as public right-of-way. And prior to that map being recorded at the Register of Deeds, they also post a bond to guarantee that those public infrastructure improvements would be built. If the developer somehow cannot, the city would have the money to do it. So we also look at how the subdivision is going to help build the transportation network, how people are going to get from where they live to where they work and want to play. And those include making sure that the network includes bike facilities, walking paths, and by connecting streets throughout the neighborhoods, we're providing those transportation choices. The city also builds, well, the city is responsible for building larger roads like arterial roads. And in those cases, we make sure that the developer, if there's a proposed road going through his site, we work with him to reserve right-of-way so that when the city's ready to build the road, there's a right-of-way available. And as part of the UDO, there's an 18-month requirement to reserve that right-of-way, allowing for the city to come purchase it at some point within that 18 months. Local and collector streets, on the other hand, the developer is responsible for constructing those. And in exchange for the dedication of the arterial right-of-way, they also are eligible for a 10% bonus in neighborhood 1. When a site comes in for development, we look at how the network is going to be extended. And we start by looking to see, are there any roads that were adjacent to the neighborhood that were placed there to be extended in the future? And we first extend those into the site and set up blocks that meet all of the city requirements. Then we also measure the external boundaries and make sure that those meet the requirements of our ordinance for block spacing. And once we do all that, then we extend them in and create internal blocks to allow for multiple ways throughout the neighborhood. We do all that, but we also have to take into account things like railroads and major streams, gas pipelines, steep slopes like topography, floodplain, because there's not very many sites in Charlotte that are flat. So we have to be able to make our network work around these things. And in some cases, we can't cross them. Or in the case of manufacturing, maybe we don't want those uses connecting through a residential neighborhood. All right, let's turn it over to Julian.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Julian Burton. I am a transportation planner with the Charlotte Department of Transportation, and I was part of the core team that worked on the language and regulations included in SSI. Just to give you a little bit of background, specifically to access and driveways, one of the elements that's in this article of SSI, or Article 32. SSI includes regulations related to access and driveways to help support the multimodal vision that's laid out in the 2040 comprehensive plan that Kevin mentioned earlier. And many of those regulations are intended to deal with access from streets into sites. But we are also formally introducing a new concept to require connections between adjacent properties or between sites on the same property outside of the street network. And this is to help provide safe and comfortable access for pedestrians, cyclists, and motor vehicles, and that's called cross access. And ultimately, cross access is going to reduce the number of cars that have to enter and exit sites for short trips, because they'd be able to access adjacent sites through the cross access connection, and that helps with safety. It reduces pedestrian and vehicular conflicts along the arterial streets. It helps with traffic because there's less cars needing to go in and out of sites onto the arterial street, which could affect traffic. And that ultimately supports a multimodal street design. Again, there's less cars coming in and out, creates a safer and more comfortable environment for pedestrians and cyclists, and encourages use of those particular modes. So just want to talk briefly about, or at a high level at least, about the requirements associated with cross access. You can see an example here in this graphic of adjacent sites being connected by a drive aisle. There's multiple ways that cross access could be achieved. This is just one example. It could also be an alley in certain situations or a service drive. But here's a very typical example of how a drive aisle could help achieve that. Cross access applies to most non-residential sites and primarily along arterial streets. So when you think about single family developments, they would be likely exempt from cross access requirements. And the requirements do include flexibility and exceptions to account for the built environment and existing conditions as well. So if a required cross access connection is currently unavailable, it's likely that a developer or owner would have to build a stub connection to that adjacent site. And then contrarily, if there's an existing stub already present, then that owner developer would likely have to connect to that and make that and complete the cross access connection. So just taking a bit of a step back and thinking more generally about driveways and access, the SSI deals with multiple elements associated with driveways and access. One main thing that it does is it formalizes the review and approval of new and existing driveways. But there's also several areas where it references another document called the Streets Manual. That's a separate document. I'll touch on it again in a couple of slides. But that's where most of the driveway and access details are actually located. And that also includes turn lane requirements, for example, which is a key piece of access requirements. That being said, there are still some of the driveway regulations that are actually included directly in SSI. That includes driveway distance from intersections, closing or relocating existing driveways, the conditions under which access may be limited to less than full movement, and standards for driveway alignment and internal access. We also include flexibility for modifications that can be approved administratively. Those would be based on safety and operational analyses and some other conditions. I also wanted to point out we have a new requirement that limits residential lots to one driveway per frontage. And there's several reasons why we've put that requirement in, but generally speaking, it limits the amount of impervious surface there is. It can protect trees and also provide for a more comfortable and usable streetscape in residential areas. So I touched on the Streets Manual a couple of slides ago. I just want to quickly go over it again. It's an important supporting document to the UDO. It includes 3 different components that work closely with the UDO. The Streets Map document, which gives a lot of supporting information on the streets map, the driveway and access rules, and then the comprehensive transportation review. And we're going to touch on this a little bit more at the January 11th meeting. But if you are curious about learning more about these different components of the Streets Manual, please click on that QR code or click on the link and visit the pages that house those documents. We're currently accepting comments and public review. So we'd love to get your feedback on those documents as well. And we're accepting comments on this first draft through January 14th. So with that, I'm going to actually turn it back over to Kevin May to talk more about network and access in SSI.
Thank you, Julian. Thank you, Josh, as well, for guiding us through both some driveway and cross access and access information, as well as some subdivision information. And as I think both of the prior presenters touched on with regard to mobility and our transportation network, it's not just streets, right? It can't just be about cars. It's also about cyclists, bicycles, and pedestrians. And so some of that comes about, some of that mobility and that network comes through off-street public paths. And so when we're talking about off-street public paths, and as you see off-street public paths in the subdivision streets and infrastructure part of the UDO, we're talking about a couple of different things. We're talking somewhat about transit trails, and you can think of those as, for example, the rail trail along the Blue Line. You can think of the greenway trails, which by way of example is, say, the Cross Charlotte Trail. And then there are some, a complementary piece to that, which is really off-street trail connections. And that's a good way to wrap your mind around this is thinking about how would you get from along a street, along a very long block, and connect to some of those off-street public paths to try to have a more efficient and a more accessible mobility and transportation network. Excuse me. And so with those off-street trail connections, and you may have gleaned this kind of in the ramp up to this, the purpose is really to connect to that park or that off-street public path and allow access to the public's facilities. Again, increasing mobility and allowing access to green and open spaces. The requirements for off-street trail connection will depend, it would vary depending on the length of the frontage of a property. It would be required to have a public access easement recorded. And importantly, they can be multi-purpose. They can be combined with other forms of required access that properties may provide, or must provide. And then finally, as we begin to wrap up the presentation portion of this evening's conversation, just circling back briefly to those pieces of other infrastructure. Those are drainage, water, and sewer. Drainage currently is touched on in the subdivision ordinance, but it will be relocated going forward in the UDO and will be housed in Part 9, the stormwater and natural resources part of the UDO. So if you're interested in learning more about drainage and or just generally stormwater or natural resources, I would encourage you to register for the January 5th virtual conversation regarding stormwater natural resources, where drainage will be touched on. And then lastly, with new development, we want to ensure that they're connected to water and sewer, and each of those different facilities come with a public or private option. Circling back a little bit to where we're at overall with the project, as we stated, the first draft of the UDO was released in early October. We're currently going through our first public engagement and comment period, which will carry us through January 2022. We are accepting comments, much like with the Streets Manual, comments and feedback and review on the first draft of the UDO through January 14th. And I would encourage all of you that have joined us this evening to stay very much up to date and to hear more information about the UDO, to make use of our Charlotte UDO website at charlotteudo.org. This flyer and this slide will give you a good indication as to the virtual conversations that have already taken place, but ones that more importantly are still yet to come. Again, today we're covering subdivision network and access and other infrastructure, but of very keen interest to a lot of folks, coming up in a couple of days on Thursday, we're going to have 2 sessions of a virtual conversation, which we will present and enter in a dialogue with the community regarding our neighborhood zoning districts. So if you're in a neighborhood and you really want to know what maybe some of the key things that you need to be aware of with the UDO approach going forward, I would encourage you very much to try to plan to attend one of those 2 meetings on this coming Thursday. You can register via the QR code on this slide, or also you can find the registration information at our charlotteudo.org website. Again, these virtual conversations on various topics will take place from now through January 11th. As you can see here by the flyer, they focus on different and specific topic areas. They're scheduled for 1 hour each, one at noon that extends to 1, and then one later in the evening from 6 to 7. And we do record these and try to make them available if unfortunately, your schedule doesn't permit you to participate live. I think I touched on this, but again, it's worth reiterating. Registration is required to participate. And again, you can register online using that QR code or going to charlotteudo.org. And yet another plug for our website. That's where you can find the complete first draft of the UDO and submit comments, feedback, and questions on that first draft of the UDO. And you'll also see there important information like our upcoming schedules, upcoming meetings, supporting documents, FAQs, just to name a few. And lastly, I wanted to touch base because I think this is worth pointing out that it's understandable that a development regulation, a development document, 600 some pages long, can be a little bit cumbersome and hard to navigate, and can kind of be a beast to read. That being said, the UDO team and the city has compiled a reference guide. You may want to call it a user guide as well, that provides an easy explanatory tool to better navigate and understand some of the concepts and a portion of the changes, important changes that are included in the new UDO approach. You can find that reference guide by going to our charlotteudo.org website, and it's available from the tab at the top called Helpful Resources. And again, it provides a summary of some of the new regulatory concepts, as you can see here, including some new residential overlays, parking tiers, tree preservation, and topical for what we're talking about tonight, transportation improvements. That concludes the presentation. We didn't have any questions that were submitted prior to this evening's conversation. I'm looking through the chat. I do not currently see any questions that have been submitted that need to be addressed. But I want to, we've got 20 minutes. Do any of our attendees have any questions that you'd like to hear more about, or some clarification that you're seeking based on this presentation and maybe some understanding of the SSI part of the UDO? Okay, we've got a comment from WL, and for WL, I appreciate that. Thank you. And his question is, for cross access, will an easement between neighboring property owners be required to be recorded at the Register of Deeds? So the cross access master of all trades, Julian, would you like to answer that for WL?
Unmuted. You can say it.
Hey, Kevin, can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
Hey, sorry, I switched rooms to join my CDOT friends. The short answer is yes. We didn't want to go into too much detail tonight, but yes, there would be an easement required for those cross-access requirements. That would need to be recorded.
Thank you, Julian. Thank you, WL, for that question. What else is out there on people's minds that you've got a question about? Anything else? Okay, not hearing anything right now from attendees. Any Team Charlotte comments or staff comments? Okay, I will interject, and I would be remiss if I didn't do this on behalf of our engagement team. We try to do our best to reduce the chat comments and condense them into a memorialized document to be able to pass on through our websites what the community is talking about, what they're asking, what their feedback is, so that you have the benefit of being able to see the conversation as we enter into these dialogues for you all. And then also available, as I said earlier, we try to record these, so if you're not able to participate live, they're available for reference later. WL, I see you've submitted another question. If a neighboring property owner will not agree to a cross-access easement, will that prevent subdivision and new development? What say you, Team CDOT?
Unmuted.
Yeah, thanks for your question. So cross-access is going to be triggered with new development for a new primary structure or a subdivision. If there's an existing building there, existing site that is not either part of the subdivision or not putting up a new structure, they're not going to be required to connect or create a cross-access connection. The new development, if it was adjacent to it, would be required to stub to it. And then when the existing development redeveloped or was part of a subdivision, then they would be required to complete that cross-access connection. But it's not something that's going to be retroactively implemented or enforced on existing development. It's going to be triggered by new development. And let me know if I need to clarify any of that further. Okay.
Awesome. Thank you, WL. Thank you, Julian. Cross-access, popular topic tonight. Understandable. New concept. Anybody else have any further questions, comments? And I will, as we leave you guys a little bit time to ponder anything that you may want to ask or comment on, I will ask that Yolanda, with our City of Charlotte UDO engagement staff, maybe chimes in. I'll tell you this, I don't nearly give the engagement folks on our team probably the due that they deserve, but I'm probably forgetting a key segment or maybe some points that we want to be able to stress and reiterate as for engagement going forward. So Yolanda, what can you tell the folks here about engagement going forward?
You did a really good job, Kevin. So just thank you guys for being here. First off, I know Kevin has said that, but we want to just reiterate that. Additionally, we do have engagement going forward. We do have additional conversations. So as you signed up for this one tonight, Kevin showed you in his presentation how to find those other engagement points of contact on our website. So we'd love to have you in additional sessions. If you have neighborhood groups or anyone you can share them with, as far as we can get them out, we would love to be able to push this information out. So just thank you, and follow us on all of our socials, CLT Planning. We are on Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube at CLT Planning. So you could definitely follow us there for updates, information. If you want to ask us a question, you can definitely shoot us DMs or inboxes as well. So thank you.
Thanks, Yolanda. I appreciate it. And thanks for you and Mariah and the rest of the team for everything that you do to facilitate these community conversations. So we're coming up to 6:45, and I don't necessarily want to end our conversation, but I'm more than happy to give everybody 15 minutes in their day back. Give you just a few more seconds, and please submit anything that you may have a question, a comment, or some feedback on. And if not, I'll just say one more time, thank you for being here. I would encourage everybody to continue the conversation and your engagement. We're committed to doing the same with you. And it's just as much, about what we're trying to do for the community is just as important as your feedback to being sure that we're giving you the kind of community that you want. Those of you that are on here tonight, I know there's been a lot of talk about neighborhood zoning districts. Please, if you're at all curious as to what the changes in the UDO may be in concerning neighborhoods, feel free, or please register for that 12/16 conversation sessions on zoning. So I don't see anybody posting anything else. So I will say thank you. You all enjoy the rest of your evening, and we look forward to seeing some of you on the next conversation. Thank you.